Welcome to Inside East African Politics.
Great to be here.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into President Isaias Afwerki's 2025 Independence Day address.
Right. These speeches are always significant.
Exactly. It's like a window, isn't it, into his thinking, his priorities.
But you have to look closely.
Not just what's said, but
Yeah,
what's not said. That's key.
absolutely. The omissions can be very telling.
So our mission today, let's unpack this, see how it positions Eritrea regionally, globally.
Especially regarding Ethiopia, seems like.
Yes, and then contrast that with the silence on major internal issues.
Yeah, it's a fascinating exercise. You see, these addresses, especially from long-serving leaders, they're not just speeches.
They're strategic tools.
Precisely. Managing the narrative, projecting an image, reinforcing control. It's all quite calculated.
Okay, so let's start with the spoken part. How does he kick things off?
Well, he goes broad right away. A big critique of the global order.
Targeting the U.S. specifically.
Oh, yeah. He really questions their standing, points to the national debt, calls it wasteful.
And contrasts it with China.
Explicitly. Says China's achieved preeminence in industrial output. He even kind of dismisses U.S. military might despite showy parades.
Interesting. So setting a tone right from the start. What about the financial system globally?
That's another big theme. Criticizes it as based on zero-sum games, speculation,
And sanctions.
and the illicit weaponization of sanctions. It fits this narrative of global injustice.
Which also has externalized problems.
Exactly. It shifts blame for maybe domestic issues onto these big, powerful outside actors.
That idea of external forces seems central.
It really is.
Right.
You hear phrases like Washington's fosters, the ideology of domination.
Framed as the root cause of instability.
Pretty much everywhere, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Including alleged subversion against Eritrea itself. It simplifies things, us versus them.
And that justifies.
It helps justify tight state control, defending against the external threat.
Okay, let's bring the focus closer to home. Africa and the Horn.
Describes Africa as still marginalized, stuck in a primitive subsistence economy.
But he sees potential change. Even from unexpected places.
Yeah, quite an interesting bit there. Suggests even Trump's inward-looking nationalism might unintentionally shake things up, create new opportunities.
That is unexpected. And regional integration. Does he mention that?
Oh, yes. Reaffirms commitment to robust regional ties. Talks about mutual respect, cooperation.
Framing it as essential for independence.
An obligation, he calls it. Though, the reality of regional relations is often complex.
Right. And when he talks about actual crises, like Sudan or Ethiopia.
The focus is heavily, almost entirely, on external interferences and acts of subversion.
Downplaying internal factors.
Largely, yes. While external actors can play a role, it overlooks the big internal drivers: governance, ethnic tensions, politics.
Now, the part that really stood out to me was just how much time he spent on Ethiopia in an Eritrean Independence Day speech.
You're right, that was striking. A significant chunk. He traces Ethiopia's issues back decades.
And again, blames.
Washington's fosters, primarily. And critiques the move towards ethnic polarization after the Cold War.
He did mention the initial hope around recent reforms there, didn't he?
He did. Talked about the euphoria and optimism initially with the presumed reform.
But then...
Quickly pivots. Says external forces got worried and declared wars against the Ethiopian people, using different excuses.
And he named some very specific, very sensitive things as pretexts.
Exactly. Things like the ideology of Oromoma, which he claims doesn't represent the Oromo people, and Cushitic Semitic antagonism.
Framing internal issues as external plots.
Essentially, yes. Calling them externally manipulated pretexts. He says Ethiopia's people have chosen opposition, and Eritrea had no regret for its initial support, blaming outsiders for derailing things.
Okay, so that covers a lot of what he did say. Global stuff, regional Ethiopia. But the silence, let's get into that.
Right, because the strategic silence, as you called it, it's arguably just as important.
What are the big things missing?
Well, despite talking about global economics and Ethiopian politics, there's almost nothing substantive on Eritrea's own internal challenges.
Like the indefinite national service. That's huge.
Precisely. He mentions popular participation through the defense forces for development.
But not the reality of it.
Zero acknowledgement that it's mandatory, indefinite, often lasts decades. It's widely documented as forced labor, low pay, harsh conditions.
Devastating for young people, for education.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole issue of democratic governance.
Which is?
Completely absent from the speech. No talk of elections. The last were in '93.
Wow. And the Constitution, legislature?
The 97 Constitution isn't implemented. No legislature since 2010. He's been the unelected leader since independence.
And human rights abuses. Things like detentions, disappearances.
Entirely overlooked. No mention of arbitrary arrests, the G15 dissidents who vanished, journalists, or the severe restrictions on basic freedoms.
That silence is deafening.
It denies the documented reality.
What about the economy? Beyond general development.
Just those general remarks. Nothing on the specifics like the massive debt ratio, reportedly over 200% of GDP.
Or education spending, school access.
Critically low spending, lots of kids out of school. None of that gets specific mention.
So this isn't just forgetting things. It's a strategy.
It has to be seen that way, yes. It controls the narrative, deflects accountability.
And reinforces that siege mentality you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. We're under threat from outside, so we need tight control inside. It all connects.
So wrapping up, the speech is really a masterclass in outward focus.
Absolutely. Championing external sovereignty, regional commentary.
While maintaining this deep silence on critical internal issues.
Right. Independence, sovereignty, unity, those are the watchwords externally. Internally, it's a different story, left unsaid.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? He champions sovereignty so fiercely.
Yeah.
But can sovereignty be fully exercised when the leadership won't even acknowledge fundamental internal challenges like forced labor, lack of democracy, human rights issues?
It's a profound question. That gap between the official narrative and the lived experience, it's significant. What does that disconnect mean for the future? Something for you to consider.